Welcome into the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show for August 15th, 2024. It is Thursday night. It is 7 p.m., and that means it's time to talk fantasy football, ladies and gentlemen. I am Eric Balkman from the Fantasy Football Players Championship, MyFFPC.com. You know me from the High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour, the RotoViz High Stakes Lowdown, and, of course, this program as well. I want to welcome in my guest tonight, a guy that I've wanted on the show for quite a while. He is the co-founder, co-owner of RotoViz, at RotoViz on the X. Of course, rotoviz.com, at Dave Caban, FF, Dave Caban. Welcome into the HSFF show. Thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight, man.
Oh, yeah. Looking forward to it. Definitely glad to join. Everybody may have heard my dog behind me coughing up a lung here at the start of the podcast, but don't worry, that's not a sign of how things are going to go. I think, it can only go up from here.
Listen, I have my kids come into this podcast all the time and interrupt me, and they bring in the cats and they show the cats into the camera. It's really annoying. It's going to happen. That's okay. We'll try to get to everybody's fantasy football questions who hang out in the chat on YouTube, X, Facebook, and so on and so forth. As a reminder, the Fantasy Pros Championship has drafts filling every day. $1 million grand prize. You can draft all the way up until midnight tonight. $6 million prize pool, $6 million plus prize pool, $50 discount every third team you register at myffpc.com. They're the fastest filling drafts out there. And for sure, check out the FFPC main event, the FFPC Superflex Best Ball Tournament, and the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, which, by the way, 2 years ago, Dave, the finishers, number one, Connor O'Driscoll, number two, was Com Kelly, and I'm trying to think, was it
Blair and Sean? Blair Andrews, Sean Siegel.
That's who it was. Blair Andrews and Sean Siegel. Thank you.
Well, the funny thing is, we've had a lot of teams do very well, very successful over the years, and normally, a group of us, we all do them. I somehow have managed to not be on any of the teams that have hit like in one or two, and my wife's always like, "What's going on?" So maybe this year will be the year.
This could be the year to take down that $300,000 grand prize. MyFFPC.com if you want to compete against guys like Dave and the RotoViz guys. And then, of course, if you're looking for Dynasty Leagues and Empire Dynasty League startups, MyFFPC.com is where to go for that. Dave is a Dynasty expert. We'll actually get into some Dynasty stuff before we sign off tonight. We're going to go around the NFL in this first segment. We're going to find out where Dave stands on certain players and offenses in 2024. In the second hour, we'll put them on the clock. Would you rather draft certain players like Michael Pittman, Zay Flowers, Trey Benson, Mike Gesicki? And we'll get into Dynasty stuff later on. And Dave, I think the other thing I want to kind of pepper throughout the show, and maybe you can lead us off with this. I know it's a little heavy to start off the show, but the RotoViz range of projection model, which I think is really important. It's something you really don't see a whole lot if at all, in the industry whatsoever. But I know it's something that you work very hard on. The RotoViz guys work very hard on as well. Can you give us kind of a taste? Because I know that this is going to come up when we talk about players tonight. It's going to come up a lot. Can you give us a little taste of kind of what that tool is and why it's important to be successful in fantasy football?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that we've kind of refined over the course of almost a decade now. But essentially, the idea behind the tool way back when we started putting these together was, if you're looking at a player for a given season, right? And I think the first time I wrote about it, it was like, all right, if we're trying to figure out what Tyrod Taylor might do next season, well, we could look at how Tyrod Taylor did last season and use that to draw some conclusions. Maybe the season before that. But then you're only looking at a sample of like 2 seasons. So maybe you say, all right, well, what's a quarterback that he was like? To fast forward to this year, you might say somebody like Trevor Lawrence, who I'm excited to talk about later, right? Trevor Lawrence, if you look at his last couple of seasons, what does that look like? But if you really want to get this range of outcomes to see what a reasonable expectation could be for him in a good season or in a bad season, how do we do that? Well, what we do is I set up a tool. It's got an algorithm behind it that does some statistical things to basically look at, and there's weightings to it, that it assigns a percentage weighting to the player's most recent season, the season before that, and it's going to look at their stat line and the stats that matter and the stats that correlate with fantasy points and those that carry from year to year. And then it builds this pool of players from historical seasons that match into that statistical profile. From there, the tool is going to go and it's going to gather those top 50 matches, and it's going to look at how those players performed in the next season. So what we're doing then in the tool is using those data points to visualize and actually kind of objectively quantify what a range of outcomes might look like. So you can see where this player's comps were most heavily concentrated. Was it 12 points per game, 15, 20? The top 75th percentile for this player, was it at 20 points? Was it at 18? And it gives us a much better way to understand a player's upside and downside. And especially because you can really quantify where those players are concentrated. I think one thing that happens too often in the industry is we talk about upside as a player's absolute ceiling, but that can be very, very misleading. So to me, it's kind of more an exercise of, if you look at this player's distribution of his range of outcomes, where is it most heavily concentrated? And what does the 75th or the 25th percentile look like? Because that's really where it's more likely to fall. And then the other neat thing that you can do with this, when you actually go to the site and you look at the tool, you have very easy visual ways of comparing those players' distributions, and you can answer a lot of questions. Then what we've done this year is I have a very complex process for building subjective projections for a team, where I'm looking at the efficiency for each player. I'm looking at team play volumes, doing a lot of analysis to make sure that I'm grouping things within historical boundaries. And then from there, I'm building a baseline projection for a team, but I'm also doing a lot of things to explore if a player is able to, build on the market shares that I might assign or fall, but cutting at things from two ways to really have a holistic view of what you can expect from a player. And I think it's important because it fills a lot of gaps that we typically have in analysis that happens. So I just threw a lot at you, so I'll pause there.
No, number one, that's awesome. Number two, it's a lot to take in. Number three, you can apply this to your FFPC main event teams. If you're drafting in the FFPC main event this year, myffpc.com, or just scan the QR code that our producer, Sean Engel, has put up on the screen right now. I think it's important to understand, okay, so in theory, Dave, this all makes sense. In theory, like, you can look at this and say, okay, this should be a valuable tool for me in drafting my teams going forward. Can you give us sort of like the success stories where this has made sense? Maybe at a time when RotoViz was really high on a guy because of a range of outcomes, or kind of low on a guy. And we'll get into this because I know that there are certain players that the model is high on that maybe a lot of other people are not high on. And vice versa too. But over the years, this has really helped you out as a drafter, and it's helped RotoViz subscribers out as drafters as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to think of one of the best examples of it. I think, a good one was one year, when Ben Roethlisberger started to fall off a little bit, there was one year the tool was kind of picking up and getting ahead of it. And I can remember people sending me messages being like, what are you talking about? Like, look at I think it was his AYA from the season before. And I was like, look, I am not the one telling you this. What we're seeing is quarterbacks with this profile tend to have a fall off. That was a good example. I kind of forget other, ones that are really poignant that stick out. But the larger thing is, because we have the math behind it, I can kind of know with a pretty good range of accuracy how often players are going to finish between certain areas. So as a result of that, I can say like 50% of the time, this player is going to land in this area. When you start to be able to approach things like that and you apply it over all of these teams that you're building and all of these players that you're drafting, that's how the success comes to manifest, right? Because you have a better understanding of what you can really expect from a player. And, you might start to think about upside differently, and you're approaching that upside differently than just saying, if things go great for this team, this guy's going to explode.
Right.
You're finding some players people are missing out on that element of the story because they're not seeing that, this player hits their what you might consider their 75th percentile outcome, like in 30% of his outcomes.
I think that's the other thing too. If I was building this model, as I know you guys did, especially you, Dave, when you hit on a player where you get a lot of venom spat back at you by subscribers, by X users, whatever, that at that point, I'm like, okay, I might be onto something here, right? And then you're ahead of the curve, and you're like, okay, I'm going to reap the benefits of this in these best ball tournaments and these managed leagues tournaments, and it's worked out for you over the years. And I think that's the thing I kind of want to do. And you'll give your twist on this on not every single one of the players we talk about tonight, but on a lot of the players that we talk about tonight. And I want to get into kind of a confusing player for the model because Jahmyr Chase is in a situation right now where he's not an old player. He is not a player who has had a lot of injuries. He is not a player who has shifted to a new offense, new OC. Like everything's the same with him, except he's waiting on a new contract extension. This is a player, according to Ben Baby, who covers the Bengals for ESPN.com, has been holding in recently. In fact, Tuesday's practice was the first practice he missed while he's trying to get a contract extension. Now, he had been playing in drills or competing in drills, whatever, participating in drills. This is a different thing that's happened this week where he's out. A lot of players have gotten, a lot of wide receivers have gotten big time extensions, new contracts this offseason, and Chase seems to want one, as well as his teammate T. Higgins, who is playing on the franchise tag this year. Mike Brown has already said, who's the team president of Cincinnati, that a deal for Chase to be heading to another team is unlikely. That was before the start of training camp. I think we can all agree it's still unlikely that Jahmyr Chase gets traded. He's 24 years old. He's entering his 4th season, 2 years left on his deal. The second year is being a guaranteed 5th-year option. Zach Taylor told the media on Tuesday that Chase is day-to-day, so it is what it is with that. And I would imagine that a deal does not come to fruition this, before the start of the season. I would think that it would come next season. However, there's a non-zero chance of anything. And there's also a non-zero chance that we could be seeing Jahmyr Chase miss some time at the early part of the season until he has to come in for his, to not have his year toll, essentially. Yep. So what I want to bring up is with you, Dave, I don't think it's likely that he misses a good part of the season. I don't think that's going to happen. However, if he continues to sit out drills and he continues to miss time and just, is saddling up for week 1 and everything's honky-dory and he's going to go out and play, that's fine. But I am a little skittish about this missed time because we have seen this before where players fall behind on football shape and have these soft tissue injuries. I know he's 24, and I know this kind of stuff normally doesn't happen to a guy like him. But when you consider that this guy is going at the 106 in FFPC drafts right now, he is the 3rd wide receiver off the board. If you were in a similar spot, wouldn't you want to look elsewhere other than Chase? Take a guy like St. Brown or Jefferson or A.J. Brown, guys who have no contract situations, guys who are participating right now, and let Chase fall down the draft board. How do you feel about this situation as it currently stands?
So this is one that gets trickier and trickier as the days go by. I think if you would ask me this question, maybe 3 weeks ago, I would have said, this feels like a scenario where the team, given how talented Chase is, has to go and they're going to get in front of this, and I wouldn't have any worry. Mm-hmm. Well, now that we're actually confronted with this, I think we need to take a step back, kind of as you're saying, and really contextualize this. I think one of the first things, we're talking about that range of outcomes tool that I'll point people towards is some of these guys that you mentioned, like, for example, Amon-Ra St. Brown, A.J. Brown, in these objective-based models are actually very comparable, if not ahead of him in some of the pieces of information you would look to take away from them. So when you start to get into a situation where it's possible, you could miss some games from this player, might take him a week or 2 to get back to the level of production that we've seen out of him. And albeit maybe, 3rd most talented wide receiver in the league, but there are options ahead of him that I think, you could turn towards. So I think if I'm on the clock, maybe this week, next week, I am now, going to be thinking about going St. Brown ahead of him. And some of this, I think you can make a case for even absent of the potential holdout situation. So if you're, this is the point now, you need to find ways that you pick between these players. And it's very rare that you have concrete pieces of information that you can attach to a player when you're actually drafting, right? When the season starts, you don't know, you can guess, but you don't really know how things are going to play out. If you start to get signal that a player is going to miss some games, it's hard not to factor that in. You have to.
I think you're totally right. And while I do believe this is the difference, like I think a lot of high stakes players I talk to are like, well, he's going to play. The collective bargaining agreement is totally anti-player in this sort of situation. And yeah, I mean, that's true. But at the same time, like we got to understand, like these guys are missing time. They're missing reps. They're not going to be in football. Like we have seen players like this skip this valuable time and then have these injuries earlier in the season or be more prone to it. And that's what has me skittish, especially with a first round, player like Jahmyr Chase is here. I think that we should move on here and talk about another receiver. This to me is being underreported, in my opinion. And maybe it's underreported because it's a nothing burger. I think that Keenan Allen's weight, and this was kind of a throwaway comment in Albert Breer's post from Sports Illustrated, where he was listing off the weights of all these Chicago Bears receivers. He listed Keenan Allen, or he said that Keenan Allen weighs about 230 pounds this year. Now he's been listed at 211 with the Chargers last year, and then he's still listed as 211 with the Bears this year. But if you look at what he did against the Bills Saturday, and I watched the film on this, and granted, I knew he was heavier, playing at a heavier weight, so that's kind of poisoned my mind where I'm not looking at this totally objectively. But he did look slower in this game. And that's concerning to me for a guy who relies on separation, who relies on quick twitch skills to get open and get that even a sliver of separation, because he's been so successful at that with the Chargers over the years. I don't remember in this offseason being reported that Keenan Allen wanted to bulk up, that he wanted to add weight on. If anything, we see players getting into, past their prime. They try to shave off weight to try to be quicker, to try to be faster. In the first team offense against the Bills on Saturday, he ran every route, but he got 0 targets. DJ Moore got 3 targets. Rome Odunze got 2 targets. 5 of his 10 routes that he ran on Saturday were from the slot, which is good because Keenan Allen, we know, is talented from the slot. However, this weight thing is really weighing with me right now. Pun not intended, but kind of intended. Wide receiver 37 in the Fantasy Pros Championship right now at the 702. This is Diontae Johnson, Jaden Reed, Christian Watson territory. Let's talk about Keenan Allen, what you think about him in the early 7th round, given this reported weight gain this year.
So I'm going to be honest here. I am a big fan of Keenan Allen in the 7th round. And I actually just pulled up some of the RotoViz tools just to make sure that's really where it is, because I view that as a good value for Keenan Allen. I mean, obviously you would prefer that there's not this weight issue. I believe the report stated that he appears to be 230, right? I don't know if we have a confirmed 230.
No.
And my kind of thought is Keenan Allen, this guy is a consummate professional. We've seen him excel year over year, just deliver on expectations. So I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt. There could be some things that we could glean from that, preseason game. However, I'm a little reticent here to make any commentary about carrying that into the season. So if I weigh, this one little sample of this section in time versus everything we've seen from Keenan Allen, how I think Caleb Williams will be, what I think we can expect from the Chicago offense this year, I am not going to let this, infiltrate my thought processes too much at this point in the season, especially knowing where he is going in relation to other wide receivers. And I think that, though there are 3 really good receivers there, they also have, a pass catching back in Swift. They have a tight end in Cole Kmet that can get involved. When I run through my numbers and look at my scenarios, even if I'm looking at my subjective projections and I start to control for what a down season could look like for a player like Keenan Allen at this point in his career, I still think that we're looking at a guy who in a lot of scenarios I shouldn't say far outplays, but at least satisfies that fringe wide receiver 3 level type of ADP, while at the same time having the possibility of creeping into that fringe wide receiver 1 territory. And it's very rare that you have players in that stratosphere that you can say you've seen do that year over year over year.
Right. So to sum up, early 7th round, wide receiver 37, you're still on the Keenan Allen train, right, Dave?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
It's funny because I own him in a lot of dynasty leagues, and I saw this and I'm like, ooh, with the age, with the new offense, and it like bells went off in my mind. I'm like, okay, should I be looking to do something here?
I'll grant you, from a dynasty perspective, I do think it's a slightly different animal. Than we're just talking redraft.
Right, but you say that it's different because, okay, so if you're ignoring, I don't want to say ignoring, But if you're not putting a whole lot of stock into this,
Yep.
how does the Keenan Allen dynasty angle change with this reported weight gain by Albert Breer?
Yeah.
Where
Well, I guess
he was just basically eyeballing it, as you said before.
right. I guess it would change, in my opinion, that you have to calculate in the value. And also, for me, Keenan Allen might be at the point now where even absent of a report like this, I would be interested in jettisoning him,
Right.
kind of rotating things in my roster, seeing what I could get. Because the reality is, even if he goes out and has a really good season this year, no matter what happens, I think he's going to reach that age bracket now where people start to view him differently, regardless of how this season goes.
And that was sort of my approach with Keenan
Yep.
Allen after the end of last season, where I was like, okay, I understand the age. I understand he could be moving on to a different team. I put out the feelers and continue to put out the feelers this offseason, sent some offers, couldn't find anything that made sense to me. So when I see a report like this, I'm kind of like, does this drastically change anything for me? No, because I couldn't get anything what I was looking for earlier, and I don't want to punt for 40 cents on the dollar at this point, which it sounds like from my league mates, that's what I'd have to give up in order to get something. And I'm not interested in doing that.
Yep.
Okay, moving on. Another wide receiver, Jordan Addison. Kevin Seifert from ESPN reported that Jordan Addison's ankle injury apparently is not going to cost him any extended time, according to head coach Kevin O'Connell. This is a guy who got carted off during last Thursday's practice, but apparently avoided major injury right now. We'll talk about J.J. McCarthy later on in the program because I think that's an interesting dynasty angle that people are not talking up enough, especially in Superflex dynasties. But focusing on Addison right now, again, for redraft here, Dave, you're looking at Jordan Addison as wide receiver 50 at the 10:06. Brian Thomas, Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, Romeo Dobbs area. Me personally, I'm still willing to take the chance there over a lot of those guys because I do think that Sam Darnold is talented enough to get good seasons out of Jefferson and Addison this year. Hockenson, I don't know because I don't know when he's going to be coming back, but I still think Darnold is good enough to get good seasons out of those guys. And yeah, wide receiver 50 at the 10:06. It's not like he's going to finish as a top 10 receiver this year, but I still like that value there. Has this ankle injury news that he's not going to miss any extended time for whatever that means from Kevin O'Connell, has that changed the way that you view Jordan Addison this year?
I think that, getting the report that we're not expecting any significant time certainly helps out. I did have some concerns when you start seeing off the field stuff happening with Addison, then you're getting injury reports. The quarterback situation, we now have a little bit of clarity on, who's going to be throwing the ball to Addison. To bring back to this range of outcomes type of concept. Now, one of the things that the model does not know is that we have this change at quarterback. But I will say, if you're looking at guys that are wide receivers in their second year and ranges of outcomes in that the tool produces, it really loves Addison's progression into year two. Over 50% of his matches were beyond 10 PPR per game, a very good chunk over 15. Of course, we have to account for the change that we've seen. I do think that if you look at, market share changes that you could make, some efficiency changes, some team level play volume changes that you could see for him, we're still looking at Addison outpacing where he's being selected in FFPC drafts, as of now. So unless we were to see this kind of, I guess, hype kind of generate for him for whatever reason over the next couple of weeks, I still like him at the ADP. That said, I normally am pretty leery of going after players that have injuries, but from the reports that I've seen, it doesn't sound like it's too serious as of now.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's like I'm sometimes, buying the dip for me is not something I'm willing to do. But in this situation, when it comes that late in the draft, and I know the upside with Addison, and I know the year that he had last year, granted with Kirk Cousins, I'm willing to buy the dip for a guy like Addison right there. Not that it's been a significant dip, given that the news has been mostly positive after this ankle injury, but he's a guy I'd be more looking at than I was prior to this in the 10th round. Third straight player we're going to talk about from the NFC North, and that's Jahmyr Gibbs. According to Jordan Schultz, NFL insider for Bleacher Report, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be ready, or should be ready, against the Los Angeles Rams for week 1. This is what Dan Campbell told reporters yesterday morning. It was a hamstring injury on Monday. Schultz said that this is not a long-term issue. Again, as long as there's no setbacks or anything like that, he should be good to go against the Rams. Against the Rams last season in the postseason, Gibbs had 8 carries, 25 yards, 4 catches, 43 yards, which is pedestrian, but that's okay because even a pedestrian performance like that still carried double-digit fantasy points, which is what we like to see. As far as his ADP goes, he has now slipped to running back 6. He was running back 4. But this injury has put him back over the last 2 days in our mid-stakes contest in the FFPC. Jonathan Taylor's moved ahead of him. Saquon Barkley's moved ahead of him. I don't think Derrick Henry makes the move from 210, where he's at right now, to 203, where Gibbs is at right now. This is another guy. Are we buying the dip? This is a guy that you probably had to soak a late first-round pick in prior to the injury. Now you can get him in the early second. How does that sound to you, Dave Caban, about Jahmyr Gibbs?
That sounds good. Right. And I think that it's not so much that I'm buying the dip here, because to me, this isn't the type of report that's going to make me change my stance on a player all that much. And if I'm looking at the top level running backs this year, I do think there is some separation when you get behind Gibbs in the ADP that we might have seen if you go back 2 or 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. So now that he's in the range where I'm looking at our FFPC dashboard tool here, right? And I am seeing Jahmyr Gibbs around that Saquon Barkley type of range. I much prefer to add Gibbs to my team than Barkley, even with this type of injury. So, we can frame it as buying the dip. I'm definitely going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing too. It's like, I know it's a soft tissue injury. I know he's had a history of hamstring injuries dating back to college, but at the same time, it seems minor. I'm trying to read between the lines here to see something nefarious, which I think we all should be doing, especially in preseason. I'm not seeing much there. And the fact that he slipped, I mean, granted, it's only a half round, but it's a half round from the first round to the early second round. That's much more significant than the early 10th to the mid 10th, or you know what I mean? That's the thing with Gibbs here.
I mean, the best part about it now too is if you're in, pick 10, 11, 12, you might be able to, make a real nice anchor to that team that includes Gibbs and another player that you were really interested in having, as your first player on your team. And, maybe you would even have taken Gibbs if you were at like pick 6 or 7. So I think it will all work out for teams that can get him.
On average, I mean, now you can start your draft in the Fantasy Pros Championship. AJ Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs. You could go Garrett Wilson, Jahmyr Gibbs. You want to start running back. You go Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs, which is funny because some people were starting a couple of weeks ago, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor. And now they've totally flipped, which is wild. But this is what happens in high-stakes fantasy football. Okay, moving on here. Jaylen Wright. Let's talk about him here for a second. Jaylen Wright was in the news with Pro Football Network's Adam Beasley yesterday, saying that he believes Jaylen Wright is going to have a role in the Dolphins offense this season. He's in a weird spot, right? Because he was drafted as a rookie running back this year, but he's behind Raheem Mostert. And he's behind DeVonta. He was the 120th pick in the draft this year. And obviously, not only does he have the speed that Mike McDaniel likes, but the fit with that outside zone running scheme obviously is a good fit for Jaylen Wright in Miami last year. 10 carries for 55 yards and a touchdown with 1 target against the Falcons this year in preseason. McDaniel said yesterday that Wright, Mostert, and Achane would, quote, determine who gets the ball and how frequently and how much during the game. Wright says he's comfortable in the offense and a player. Here's why I like Jaylen Wright so much. Like, far be it for me to criticize Raheem Mostert, especially after the season that he came off of, Dave. But I look at that guy as, prior to 2023, had a lot of issues staying healthy. He's a year older. I know they extended him, but it wasn't a huge extension. It's really, really difficult for me to see Raheem Mostert being fantasy viable, being fantasy relevant over the course of a 17-game season. I can invest in Jaylen Wright, either in best ball or especially in managed leagues, as running back 43 at the 1104. And know that there's going to be some weeks this year where I can flex him out at a minimum. And if Achane misses, oh my God, even more so, with Jaylen Wright. He's in this rare position where, yeah, he's the number 3 running back, but I don't necessarily trust the 2 guys in front of him normally, regardless of position that they play. And then when you consider that their position is the most dinged up in fantasy football, I'm really, really liking the value of Jaylen Wright here in the early 11th round. What does the RotoViz range of outcomes tool say, and how do you feel about him?
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting one. To be honest, I hadn't really thought too much about Wright until, maybe obviously when I was going through my Miami work, but he was a player that I hadn't really thought too much about because I'm a huge DeVonta Chan fan.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also historically liked Mostert. But as you mentioned, there are reasons now that we do need to start thinking about him. Range of outcomes tool with him being a rookie can't actually comment on him because you need the prior season's data in there.
That's a good point. Yep, good point.
So I can't really look at that. But I guess the larger thing I would say is, I think that this is a situation where we don't necessarily even need to dig into a player's profile. We can just recognize that this offense has been a bastion of fantasy points for running backs. This is the type of offense where I feel pretty good as long as the player has a requisite level of talent, which I think that Wright does. You put them back there, they get the opportunity. They're going to deliver, like you said, usable weeks. It's going to be a rotational player on your team. The one thing that does give me a little bit of pause is, a player could have a role in an offense, and that role could be, 1 snap a game. We don't know exactly,
Yes.
right? So when I saw that, I was kind of like, it doesn't really matter. But as I started thinking about it, looking through the show sheet today, kind of getting your take, I think it does make sense to go after Wright. And look, you're drafting him in a spot where I think if you're going after running backs, you're just kind of going after that upside, right? And for a player like him, the upside is you're able to slot him into your lineup, get some weeks with the potential that he's able to get some touchdowns like we saw Raheem Mostert do last year, have a couple of explosive runs here and there. So I'm perfectly cool, with suggesting that listeners go out and add Wright to their team, knowing that there might be some signal, in the first couple of weeks that, it's not really going to happen for him. And then you just move on, but he's in that spot where that's what you're doing with those players anyways, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's home runs, right? It's
Yep.
home runs. You're swinging for home runs, not singles or doubles at that point. And Jaylen Wright is a perfect home run pick this year. Speaking of those swings that we're taking, Art Stapleton, who covers the Giants for the USA Today, said that Tyrone Tracy was actually seen running and cutting on a field at Giants practice today. This is a player who this past weekend was carted off the field and in a walking boot. I shouldn't even say this weekend. It was on Monday this week. But Stapleton said not only that, but he wouldn't be surprised if Tracy is practicing with the team next week. Now, this is one reporter's opinions on an observation, and we'll see what happens. I was of the initial opinion when I saw the news that Aircast, this is bad. This could be a season ender. And then I thought it was Giants doing damage control. And quite frankly, after watching Hard Knocks, I don't necessarily trust a whole lot of what I'm hearing out of New York and Joe Shane and all those guys. So I think then I was very skeptical that the Giants said this could be one of these things where they just like, we'll see. And then boom, he's put on PUP and he's out for the first 6 weeks of the season. It sounds like that is not going to happen, which is good for Tracy, but kind of bad for fantasy players in the FFPC who are resigned to drafting Eric Gray as the guy behind the guy with Devin Singletary. Mm-hmm. And now it's another nebulous situation with Tracy and Eric Gray. When we look at the ADPs of these guys and at fantasymojo.com, we see that while Singletary is obviously the guy being drafted first here among the Giants running backs, he is going currently as a 9th round pick. Mm-hmm. Tracy still, this is all these drafts are post-injury. Tracy 14th round, Eric Gray 17th round. High stakes players are still on board with Tracy being the backup. Is it still worth drafting Tracy 3 rounds ahead of Eric Gray, kind of knowing what we know at this point?
Honestly, I think I'm just avoiding the Giants running backs.
No interest in any Giants.
I just don't think I have any interest. I mean, I get that you could be going after the guy behind the guy. You're looking for production certain places, but I guess the question that I would pose to everybody is, do you really see any scenarios, even if Tyrone Tracy locks in into a role where there's like a 60-40 split between him and one of the other backs, do you really think that that's going to be something where you're going to be trusting that week in and week out? I have a lot of concerns over what you're going to get out of that running game this year. So I would be using those late round picks for players that are better dart throws, right? Who, you can expect a higher return on. Now you could argue with me and say, well, at that point, where are those players coming from? And I would say not New York, right? Not the New York Giants backfield this year. I don't believe. And also on top of that, I guess the other thing I would say is I think his injury is a little bit different than some of these other ones we're hearing about in that we actually physically saw it happen. We had a lot more pause for concern. So if we don't see him get back and start, being actively used, in practice, in a preseason game, and get a real clear distinction on him, then I think I'm definitely punting on him, and I'm probably punting on that Giants backfield.
It's something to keep in mind in the second half of your drafts. Yeah, you want these running backs that are just an injury away type guy. However, it's almost equally as important to be targeting offenses and situations, right? At that point, we can all draft backup running backs, but drafting the right running backs, sometimes you have to, well, not sometimes, all the time, you have to factor in what happens if Singletary gets hurt, what happens if Christian McCaffrey gets hurt, what happens if Jahmyr Gibbs gets hurt.
Exactly.
Like they're nuanced things and they're separate situations for sure. Now, one other player I want to bring up here in this segment, Isaiah Likely. Speaking of the guy behind the guy, there's a report in The Athletic yesterday that kind of continued the drumbeat that we've heard on Isaiah Likely from the Baltimore Ravens coaching staff all offseason. Todd Monken, who's the offensive coordinator for Baltimore, says he expects Isaiah Likely to have a great year. Now, again, to your point, Jaylen Wright could have a role in Miami. That role could be one snap. A great year in Baltimore, one snap per game. A great year in Baltimore could be 40 catches for 500 yards and 3 touchdowns, which isn't all that great for fantasy. But the Ravens have talked about using more 12 personnel this year to not only get Andrews out there, but Likely out there with him. Likely was really not involved as much as you'd want if you had him in fantasy last year until Andrews got hurt. I look at it from the standpoint of what am I soaking into to get Likely in a tight end premium FFPC league. Tight end 19 at the 12-10 right now. This kind of goes into, and we do have a bit of a sample size with Likely, especially in the role that he is in this year. Back up to Mark Andrews, but starter when Andrews gets hurt. What do you think about Likely and his opportunity that he's going to have this season while Andrews stays healthy or whether Andrews gets hurt?
Okay. Yeah. This one's really interesting. This is one of those where you have to think about, what a team says it wants to do versus what we've seen it actually do. And if you go into our game splits app, what you'll see is Isaiah Likely in his career has had 24 games that he has played where Mark Andrews also played, 9 games. And these are regular season games, right? 9 games where Andrews hasn't played. He averaged 12.5 points in the games where Andrews didn't play, just 3.34 in games where Andrews played. That is a huge swing, right? His targets are at 5.2 when Andrews doesn't play. When Andrews plays, it's at 2.2. If I stratify things down a little bit, right, and we look at just 2023, it's an even worse picture, right? You had 7 out-of-split games, which means that Andrews was not available. Likely scored 12 PPR per game in those games on 4 targets. When Andrews was in, he saw just 1 target, just 1.65 PPR per game. When I start looking at building projections for this team this year, in a baseline scenario, I give Likely a target share of 7%. And honestly, barring a very significant injury to Andrews, I think it's hard to get Likely, beyond 10, 11% of that offense, which, it's a good offense. I like it. But for a player that's not Mark Andrews at tight end, isn't one that really moves the needle for me, right? So I'm not looking at him as the type of player that I'm going to be able to rely on in most leagues, even in tight end premium leagues, for weekly type of production. He really remains a backup option for me.
Yeah, and I think that's how you have to look at it, right? Because what happens if Andrews, I don't want to say defies the odds, but if he stays healthy the majority of the season, the pockets for Likely to be not only like he's got to have the opportunity and then he's got to come through on that opportunity, which didn't always happen. And I think you're playing a little bit with fire there for sure. So that's your take on Isaiah Likely. I happen to agree with it. When we come back, let's talk about where Dave Caban from RotoViz.com stands on guys like Trevor Lawrence, Jerry Jeudy. Let's talk about Marshawn Lloyd. Let's talk about the Rams offense. That's what we're going to lead things off with here with Dave Caban, Eric Balkman on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back right after this.
Inflation is bad. When FFPC entered the high-stakes fantasy football arena in 2008, the grand prize of the FFPC main event was $75,000. Today, after 15-plus years of setting the industry standard, the FFPC main event has a $1 million grand prize. Since 2021, the FFPC Best Ball Tournament grand prize has tripled, and the Superflex Best Ball Tournament is now the largest contest of its kind in the world.
Football. This month, more men and women will go draft than ever before in our country's history. With prize pools at record highs, multiple fantasy players will become millionaires this year playing the game they love. This month, thousands of drafters will compete in redraft, best ball and dynasty leagues, and with innovative formats, they can look forward to a host of high-stakes competition. It's August again in fantasy football, and under the FFPC, high-stakes fantasy is bigger and better than ever before. Why would you ever settle for less?
If you are looking to win big this year in fantasy football, look no further than myffpc.com. The Fantasy Pros Championship has drafts filling both at slow and live formats each and every day. We have drafts. Let's see how many more. We got 5 more on the docket scheduled for tonight with plenty of spots available. And I would venture to guess, based on the past few nights, all 5 of those are going to fill. In fact, one of them just went to red with just 4 spots remaining in the draft coming up at the top of the hour here. myffpc.com is where to go. $1 million grand prize, $6 million plus prize pool in that format. And if you want to get some advice from one of the best in the business prior to entering the draft room, how about listening to this show and watching this show on the Better Sports Network? It is Dave Caban, the founder. I gotta say, not one of the co-founders, actually, one of the co-owners. I got in just a little bit after we had been founded, so I can't take any credit there. But it was very, very close for you, right?
It was very pretty close. Yeah. You know, it's been so long now that, you know, all of these years have blurred together. I was actually just thinking to myself the other day, like, geez, it's been like a decade since we were going at this, which is pretty wild.
And can you talk a little bit about, as long as we're talking about this?
Yep.
What drew you into RotoViz so early on, and sort of the stamp that you wanted to put on it once you became part of the team, as now you are a co-owner of the website and the franchise?
Yep. So I think what it really was that drew me in at first was I read stuff at the site that had a completely different take than I had ever seen before. And everything was founded in some type of, measurable statistic or tangible thing that could be pointed to. There was an intellectual underpinning. Mm-hmm. There was reasons behind the arguments. There was evidence supporting the conclusions and the suggestions being made, which, back at the time, analysis might just be like, oh, like, look at the way this guy runs. He just looks so powerful, right? So there's a big difference between somebody saying something like, oh, well, the great thing about this player is his yards per carry were this, in this year, versus reading something from somebody. They say, well, like, if you break down and you look at yards per carry, you'll see that they aren't necessarily sticky from year to year. They don't necessarily entirely relate just to that back. We've seen, if you do a study and you take a player's yards per carry and you move them between offenses, those things don't hold, which at the time that was like revolutionary stuff. And then the other thing that really drew me in were some of the tools that Fantasy Douche had built at the time, which was just so neat because it set you up to go in and kind of do your own research. And I think part of what makes fantasy fun is beyond, for a lot of people at least, it's not so much just the being able to sweat things out on a Sunday, winning the league. It's feeling like, you are in control of a team and that you're doing the analysis, you're making the conclusions, and you're getting to do all of these neat things to manage your roster. So it was kind of like the confluence of those events. And then, I read some of Sean Siegel's work, was just absolutely blown away by it. What I really loved too was just this idea that like, it's okay to question, and they're going to put their opinions out, state their case. And, if people push back, well, whatever, like at least we have good sound logic behind it. And one of the things that really stuck with me when I first started writing for the site, Fantasy Douche sent me a writer's guide. And one of the things that it talked about was like good ideas versus bad ideas. And one of the things that he highlighted was, you have a really good idea if everybody's going to tell you that it's stupid, but that it's actually not.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
He phrased it much more eloquently better than that, but I was like, yeah, this is really cool. And like sometimes your intuition isn't always right, which was one of the really fun things. You start digging through these tools, you have intuitions and you realize that they're way off. You're always learning, always adjusting. And, that's what we try to keep doing over these years. Some of the things that worked back 2014, 2015, now you have to adjust, and this game keeps evolving, and, we're trying to keep evolving with it.
I think that one of the things, because, I've been with the FFPC since the start, and I think RotoViz back in the day, especially with Fantasy Douches you're talking about, like he was one of the first guys that we talked to about like partnerships and trying to develop some synergy between our two companies. And one of the things that I thought, and this is even before we developed any kind of business partnership, one of the things that attracted me to RotoViz was number one, stuff you weren't getting anywhere else, which is what we're all looking for in fantasy analysis. RotoViz had it. And just really the first website that had these models and these tools that you could apply not only to FFPC leagues, but so much in fantasy football. That was kind of like, we hadn't seen that before. High stakes players hadn't seen that before. And now you're able to utilize everything like, and the tools that RotoViz had, you were able to utilize this to springboard you forward into drafting better teams and either confirming or not confirming, or maybe disproving your previous notions, which I think, like, I don't know about you, Dave, but I've been playing fantasy football since the mid 90s. And the first, I call these the lost years. The first years of playing fantasy football, I never ventured outside my own echo chamber. Like I got everybody down who didn't think the way I thought, who didn't believe the same things I thought. And I just wanted confirmation bias every single, confirmation bias, but you know what I'm talking about? Like, I just wanted everybody, I wanted to be surrounded by people that thought the same way I did. Fast forward to like, wow, I'm not really winning a whole lot of leagues here. Maybe I should be listening to these voices and listening to and reading more of these sites that actually challenge what I believe about football. And I got to tell you, if anybody asked me, what's been the biggest leap you've made in being a fantasy football player all these years? It's that. It's trying to get outside your, like I said, get outside your echo chamber and really test the theories and the beliefs that you have against hard and fast analysis, or just opening your mind up to things that you previously closed your mind to. I think RotoViz is a fantastic website. Again, with all the models that you guys have there, it's really like black and white. Like, okay, not saying that you're wrong or you're right, but this is a great test on if you feel strongly about a certain strategy or a player or whatever, you can test that at rotoviz.com, which is why I love that website so much.
Yeah, well, we appreciate it. That's exactly what we've aimed to do over the years. It's been a great partnership with you guys. And the funnest thing is that, over the years now, because we've had so much experience with the FFPC, and there's all of these fun formats. We've always just enjoyed the interfaces that we've been able to really dial in to those contests and have such a good feel for them. And it's been awesome being able to create tools specifically for those leagues, because there's nothing better than when you go into a draft and you're feeling like, like there's some information I have here, or there's strategies that I have that I can kind of back test and I can tell what these results have looked like historically. We make some adjustments for the year that's coming, and this is going to be so much more fun than just trying to navigate things, without any, information that you feel like is giving you an edge.
I think the other thing to keep in mind here too, and the information that we got as fantasy players 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you really had to scrimp and like really search for it, right? It was easier to find an edge back in the day.
Yes.
Nowadays, especially with the advent of, again, all these great websites like RotoViz, all these other content creators out there that are supplying you with all this information, especially when you come to mid-August, late August, we're all learning the same things. We're all listening to the same people. We're all privy to what's going on in training camp. So now where's the edge? Where do high stakes players get that edge? And I think that there is something to be said about, again, I keep going back to it, but all the tools that RotoViz has, I think that is how high stakes players can get their edge going forward. And it's something, and I'll be quite frank here with you and the viewers. This is not something, once you guys stumbled upon this is not something you just let stagnate. This is not something you just let, okay, this is our thing. Here's what we do. You're constantly developing new ideas, fresh tools, fresh models, fresh stats that really, again, challenge what we think and gives you that edge that you're looking for as a high stakes player when you're trying to win $1 million grand prize.
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate those comments. And, I think the other thing that we've tried to do too, which people, might not be able to see from the outside, is there's a lot of things that, people have suggested that we do. And they're like, oh, you should do this. People would love this. But if we know that the underpinnings underneath it are going to lead people astray, or they're going to present them with things that we know statistically don't hold and would lead them the wrong direction, we don't do it. So occasionally we'll get requests for certain type of tools. And we say, well, listen, like we could build that and people might be happy to use it, but we know that it's not going to be giving them results that are actually going to help them out. So we're not going to do that. Like everything that we've tried to do over the years, we have to firmly believe in. We have to know that tools are going to put people in the right direction, which has kind of been an interesting thing, over the years, to try to balance that. You're making sure that you're staying fresh, what you're putting out, people are going to like, but also that, it's really going to give them the results and put them, in the right direction.
Yeah, and that's what you have to do. It's a responsibility to the subscribers. It's a responsibility that you guys don't take lightly. And kudos to you, sir, and kudos again for everything you're doing at RotoViz. Okay, let's sort of like I want to get into some of the stuff that you do for RotoViz. And I know one of the big things that you did over the course of the summer was analyze all these offenses again for the range of outcomes model that you have. I'm going to kind of jump around here. I know it's listed in a certain order on the run. I'm going to jump around for the stuff I think is going to be most valuable. I want to start in Los Angeles with the Rams offense. I think it's interesting that we saw a day 3 wide receiver come on the scene last year out of nowhere and take over in this offense that had a former offensive player of the year in Cooper Kupp, that had a backfield that was really questionable after Cam Akers left, and then turned a non-pedigree guy in Kyren Williams to a supernova last year in fantasy football. And I think that's the thing that we bring into this year. An aging quarterback, a now healthy Cooper Kupp, a now injured Puka Nacua, and a backfield that not only features Kyren Williams, but Blake Corum. A lot of moving parts here. What do you suggest we do as fantasy owners in handling this Rams offense, Dave?
Yeah, so this Rams offense, super interesting, really fun. Last year we have Kyren Williams emerge as a league winner for some teams. Puka Nacua emerge as a league winner for some of these teams. And, when I wrote my piece on them, I titled it like, can the Rams offense catch lightning in a bottle again?
Yes.
Again, right? Because really, that's what it felt like last year, especially if you head back to it was anybody talking about Nacua in August doing what he was doing. I am not sure. Kyren Williams, Curtis Patrick, and I did manage to get on a couple of our FFPC squads, which we loved. But, that was like, that was one of those dart throws that we're talking about earlier. So we fast forward to this year, and, I think the offense is going to be a fine offense from an NFL type of perspective, but I'm still very excited about these options that we see there. When I start putting together my subjective based projections for this team, and I'm evaluating different scenarios, I think that in a lot of them, Kyren Williams remains an RB1. You know, Blake Corum is, I think some people would say, pretty exciting. I think, though, that, you know, if I'm the Rams, I'm going back to the well on Williams. If I look at the way I expect that usage to be spread, I'm expecting that even if, you know, there is somewhat of a rotation, a lot of the quality is going to go to Williams. As a result of that, I'm really viewing him as a strong RB1. And the interesting part about this is when last season finished, I was kind of thinking to myself, I don't know where I'm going to land on Williams this year. But when I started digging into that offense and breaking it down, assigning the market shares, looking at the efficiencies, I ended up landing on, wow, you know, this should be a pretty good season for Williams. Then I get to the wide receivers. Now, Nacua, you might have to give me a little bit more background on where we stand right now and what we know about the injury.
All right, so here's the thing with Nacua. Well, number one, I'll give you this. Puka Nacua was going at, I don't know, 108, 109 on a lot of FFPC drafts. Puka Nacua, since this injury news came out, he slipped to wide receiver 8 at the 202. Now, the latest that we know on his injury, number one was, again, damage control. We're hearing a lot of positive things. Hey, it's going to be okay. Hey, he's going to be ready for week 1. Hey, he was in really good shape before this. And we can't guarantee that he's going to be ready for week 1, but it's probably going to happen. Sarah Barshop, the last we've heard of this, which was, God, going on a week and a half ago now, is that he's okay. They play the Lions week 1, and apparently he should be ready for that game. He is week to week. McVay used the phrase, he'll be in good shape and he'll recover. No threat of anything for Detroit. Now, he could be ready for that game, but Dave, at the same time, missing all this training camp, if he doesn't practice again until before week 1, to me, that's significant. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it is. And there's something, no, I just talked about always pointing towards evidence and stuff. There's something, though, intangible in those quotes from McVay that seemed a little worrisome to me. But I think the reality is, too, when you're also looking at a player that's in an offense where he has another player, you know, that is extremely talented. I also think some of the guys behind him, like Tutu Atwell, Demarcus Robinson in this offense, could also, you know, be used. So it's not like there's a situation, I think, where if Nacua is not ready to go, they're going to force him in. Mm-hmm. So I think that the injury is a little concerning. You know, when I started digging into this team and I brought up Nacua and Cooper Kupp in the range of outcomes tool, and it does its search. It's dude, it loves Nacua this year. It gives him more upside than it does Cooper Kupp. His comps are largely concentrated beyond 15 PPR per game. What you're seeing for players like Cooper Kupp at this point in his career is kind of a flatter distribution of outcomes where you see it's largely concentrated below at like 13, 14 points per game, but it's fairly split. And Nacua, I mean, he's very much to the right of 15. So if you're looking at them based on what we've seen historically, you know, you're expecting Nacua to possibly still continue to climb. Kupp, it's not quite as clear. When I did my subjective projections for this team, I actually ended up with Nacua having one of the widest ranges of outcomes of top-level receivers, but, you know, tremendous upside. His baseline projection, I assume that he's going to be the most targeted player on the Rams ahead of Kupp. You know, we have no guarantee that that's going to hold. And with the injury now, I would say, you know, maybe it's more likely they come out fairly similar. But I think a healthy Nacua, much likelier to finish in the wide receiver 1 zone. Cooper Kupp looks to me like a wide receiver 2 in this season. So I think that I'm expecting a lot out of Williams, Kupp, and Nacua. Nacua, though, I would prioritize, even knowing this injury, pretty far ahead of Cooper Kupp. I think the rest of the players, though, I'm, you know, not super jazzed up on.
Okay, and that's fine because I don't think anybody is. This is fascinating to me because I had kind of reserved, like, over the last week or so, basically since the Nacua injury, I was kind of like, and there's been a lot of positive pub coming out of Los Angeles about Cooper Kupp. I had kind of resigned myself saying, like, Nacua early in the second round, I'm out. Like, why would I do that when it sounds like, and there's a lot of Jordan Rodriguez and a lot of these beat writers are saying it looks like the offense is going to run through Cooper Kupp this year. Kupp at the 302, wide receiver 13, to me seemed like a much better bet.
Yep.
Now, after I hear what you're saying about what your model says, I'm kind of like, how do I handle this? And obviously I'm an FFPC employee. I don't draft in the Fantasy Pro Championship or the FFPC main event. But if I was, how do I handle drafting in a tournament like that, knowing that Nacua has this crazy upside, but you got to pay up for him as an early second round pick? Or I could go with Cooper Kupp, who maybe has the flattened upside and maybe, high floor, low ceiling, going at the 302. If you, like, knowing what you just said, Dave, to me, how would you handle that in a tournament like this?
It's really tough. And I can see why people would want to be behind Kupp and avoid Nacua. I think that, we might be phrasing in this dichotomy if it's Kupp versus Nacua, where it's really, Nacua versus the other wide receivers going in his range.
Right.
And maybe Kupp, I have some concerns about Kupp, in comparison to his ADP.
You talk about this, the concerns that you have. Immediately, the concern I have is, why am I drafting a player that's going in the early third round and I'll bring this up with the other wide receivers going around him in this, just to give it contextual basis here. So when we look at Cooper Kupp going at the 302, this is Deebo Samuel, Jaylen Waddle, Chris Olave, Devontae Adams, Malik Neighbors territory. When you talk about, why am I drafting a guy with a flattened sort of S curve or whatever? Why am I drafting him there when I could be going all with these other guys? And maybe I should be down on Kupp here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it really comes down to, because I think that there's reasons to think that, in my opinion, I think it should run through Nacua at this point and not Kupp. And some of those other players around him, I would argue at this point in their career have some more upside, despite how good Kupp has been, in recent seasons. So the final thought that I had with Nacua is, if you look historically, and this is kind of what this tool is seeing here, but there's other ways we can cut at it in the RotoViz screener, for example. What Nacua did, it does not just remain a flash in the pan, right? Like, that is not a flash in the pan season like people might want to think. Mm-hmm. He's not the first player that has come out of left field. A lot of these guys that did, we kind of forget after time. I remember going way back to when Stephon Diggs was a rookie in a couple of dynasty leagues. I was adding him in the season off of the waiver wire, right? And I don't think that's the type of thing people remember, because he's completely erased that. But sometimes you look at these rookie seasons for guys and you realize it puts them into this sphere where this sphere, I should say, where these guys just continue on this trajectory. And that's why I still feel good about Kupp. Not the type of player I would have expected myself to be saying things like this about, but when I start running it through the models, I look at the offense, it just makes sense to me.
Wow, I can't believe I totally can believe that we spent that much time on the Rams offense, because it's important for fantasy this year. But another offense that's important for fantasy is Jacksonville, and I do want to get into this. You talk about a team that loses Calvin Ridley, gains Brian Thomas, Evan Engram, a player that has shown us tremendous upside, but has had issues with the training room, but he's coming off a fantastic season. Trevor Lawrence, the former number one overall pick, and then Travis Etienne, who's once again sharing the backfield with Tank Bigsby. Gabe Davis has been added to the equation. I haven't asked you this enough this segment, but Dave Caban, where do you stand on Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars offense this season?
All right. I love Trevor Lawrence. And this is another one of those I wasn't expecting till I started digging in, right? One of the major reasons is I was looking at some drafts, a couple of weeks ago. I'm seeing him going at like 16, 15, quarterback 17. But I think he has a strong potential as maybe half of the guys going ahead of him as finishing as a quarterback one. One of the first things that informs that analysis, you look in the range of outcomes tool. I look at him compared to guys like Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, Kyler Murray. He doesn't have the upside that they do. But what you realize is he's so concentrated between 18 to maybe 22 points per game, where some of these other guys with more upside, we are seeing a significant range of outcomes where they're going to score behind Lawrence. Then I start looking at the offense there with the receivers that he has. I think it's very achievable for him to get to 25 passing touchdowns, more than 4,500 passing yards. You also have some separation with Lawrence when you start looking at what he could do as a rusher. He's going to be able to pad his stats just a little bit, that it kind of pushes him into this range where I would feel pretty good about saying that I like his chances better, as I said, than about half the names ahead of him. But the thing is, he doesn't even really have to beat out Dak or Jordan Love or Kyler Murray, because in many drafts, these guys are going at a different point in the draft than Lawrence. It's not even just like, a quarterback 10 versus a quarterback 16 type of thing. It's the players that you're putting on your roster in between in those rounds. Then you're pairing in a guy that could finish as a solid quarterback one that really makes the difference for me.
I wasn't going to bring this up, but I'm just getting this breaking news in right now that Cincinnati Bengals running back Chris Evans has torn his patella tendon during today's practice, and he's going to miss the entire season. Now, I don't think anybody was falling all over themselves, Dave, to draft Chris Evans this year. However, one of the most hotly contested debates in fantasy football, as far as the backfields go, has been Zach Moss v. Chase Brown. Now, if we look at the ADP on these guys in our mid-stakes contests over the last couple of days, Chase Brown is still holding his lead over Zach Moss. 803 as running back 29 for Chase Brown. Zach Moss 901 as running back 33. Certainly, we do have a wealth of knowledge on Zach Moss, maybe not as much with Chase Brown. If you're drafting a Bengals running back here in what round would this be? You're looking at the 8th round, basically, with those guys, anywhere from the early to the late 8th round. If you're looking to draft the Bengals running back there, who is the guy?
So this one is, kind of tricky depending on how you look at it. So when I started working through what I expect for this team, I found it hard to know which one of these guys I would give a higher rushing share to. So I think that it's probably a split where they're each going to get somewhere around like 35 to maybe 40% of the team's rushing attempts. But I think an important thing to note here, and of course it was Joe Mixon, so maybe it was a little bit different, but Cincinnati's running back one role has averaged a target share of 11.4 across the last 3 seasons. Now, Zach Moss did record his highest target share of his career last year with 8%. But if I'm assigning shares this year as receivers, I'm leaning more towards Brown. And the large difference, in how I evaluate these guys comes from that, because I think he's got more potential as a receiver. Down the stretch last year, we saw him start to put together some efficient games, and that's kind of how I'm breaking that tie. I think also, a player like Zach Moss did have a very impressive year last year, but it's kind of going back to, at this point, I'm going to go with the youth to a certain degree here, right? And try to capitalize on some of the flashes that we saw from Brown. But, I don't have a huge amount of conviction.
I think that's the way high stakes players are treating it too. I mean, more often than not, they're leaning towards Brown, but there is still a lot of Moss love out there as well. And how that unfolds will be part of the story of the 2024 fantasy football season. He's Dave Caban from RotoViz.com, at Dave Caban FF on the X. I'm Eric Balkman from the FFPC. This is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. Don't go anywhere. We're going to put Dave Caban on the clock. Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, Jermaine Burton or Marvin Mims, Trey Benson or Ezekiel Elliott, all those and much more on BSN. Don't go anywhere. We're right back after this.
Flair once said, if you want to be the man, you got to beat the man. And if you want to be the man or woman this fantasy football season, you got to play over at myffpc.com. That's where all the best fantasy gamers play. That's where all the high stakes gamers play, because they've got the high stakes leagues. They have the best formats. They have the best payouts. It's the place to be. And if you win a FFPC main event or a Fantasy Pros Championship contest over there, you put some serious respect on your name and some money in your pocket. Anyone can win their hometown league, right? You're probably a great fantasy gamer. Prove it. You go out and win an event like this, you can go and put in your Twitter bio or X bio, FFPC main event champion. That means something. That's definitive proof that you're one of the best fantasy gamers in the world. So go over to myffpc.com and use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more. And now you're on your road to greatness, right? You could even do an online draft, or you can go and draft in Las Vegas with the stars. Draft at Planet Hollywood for the FFPC main event. That's where they're all doing it. It's awesome stuff. So get set up now so that you can be a star this year. You can be the man. Just like Ric Flair, you can be a champion. Woo!
11 minutes past the top of the hour here on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. I'm Eric Balkman. He's Dave Caban from RotoViz.com. I want to remind everybody, if you're looking for action, just based on that graphic you saw, myffpc.com is where to go for the Fantasy Pros Championship tonight. I just see that we have one spot left in the 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time draft tonight. We just added a new draft at 10 p.m. Already 3 spots gone in that. And, of course, 6 spots remaining if you want to draft at the top of the hour. Those drafts are all going to fill. Take your shot at $1 million. They're all in a prize pool of well over $6 million, and 1,000 people will get paid in that format as well. myffpc.com, myffpc.com. Dave Caban from RotoViz.com. I want to put you on the clock with certain players and situations this year. So let's take the leap of faith. Let's suspend disbelief that you have settled on one of these 2 players. And all these players that I've given you here are going almost right next to each other in FFPC drafts right now. So let's say you've made up your mind. I'm drafting one of these 2 guys. Who am I going to pick between these 2? And I'll start it off right at the top. 102, 103, 104 in some cases. We have seen Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb go over the last month plus. CeeDee Lamb is not playing, not practicing right now for the Cowboys as he awaits a new contract. Tyreek Hill, on the other hand, just got paid. However, CeeDee Lamb, much younger than Tyreek Hill. If you have made up your mind, you're drafting one of these 2 players at the top half of round number 1. Who's it going to be?
For this question, we're going to assume that there's no questions about CeeDee Lamb and his playing for the Cowboys this year. This is a guy that was a wide receiver 1 in 60% of weeks last season, went over 35 points 4 times. I wrote about his insane upside, but I'm still going Tyreek Hill, right? These 2 players probably have more upside by a significant margin than any of the other wide receivers I looked at this year. I run them through the range of outcomes tool. It gives a slight edge to Tyreek Hill. I do my subjective projection process. I end up with a little bit less downside, a hair more upside for Tyreek Hill. I think about the context of the teams. I have to still go Tyreek Hill. I think he finishes as the, wide receiver 1 by just a small margin over CeeDee Lamb this year. Then, if you want to remove from trying to make the question a little bit more straightforward, and you have some of the concerns about Lamb here, even though I think that's all going to work itself out, it just solidifies even more that Hill is the guy I would go with.
So regardless of the contract, you're going Hill over Lamb here.
Correct.
Okay. Interesting. Let's, and you have him in a good number of dynasty leagues too, right?
Hill? I do. Yes. Hill has been a player I've been trying to get. Lamb, though, I was trying for some time, but not quite as successfully. I was able to position myself in more cases to get Hill, which has been a lot of fun, as anybody that's had him on their dynasty rosters knows.
It's been this is why we play fantasy football.
Yes,
for stuff like that, for sure. Sticking with the wide receivers here, Dave. Let's talk about a guy who people are probably watching this. God, these guys are 75 minutes in. They haven't mentioned Brandon Aiyuk yet. What the hell kind of fantasy football show is this? And I'll tell you, no, rest assured, we are bringing up Brandon Aiyuk right now, who is still, as of this moment, a San Francisco 49er. Wide receiver 23 at the 406 is where he's going. 1 spot ahead of him at wide receiver 21 is DJ Moore on average at the 405. Where do you stand, and who would you rather draft between Aiyuk or DJ Moore? Again, August 15th, 2024.
So DJ Moore is a player that RotoViz was super high on coming out. If I remember correctly, that year, we were maybe a little bit higher on him than others on the industry. So he's kind of been like, quote unquote, one of our guys. We love DJ Moore. Still, I think that I have to give the edge to Brandon Aiyuk here, even with this kind of, sorry, I hit my mic. Can you still, you can still hear me, right?
Yes, you're good.
Even with this kind of nebulous situation, either way it works out, I think I prefer Aiyuk. One of the things that I'll point to is Blair Andrews just did a long piece where he was looking at different metrics that you can look at for wide receivers that signify that a player is going to continue to be really good or is on the precipice of becoming, an elite wide receiver in the league. One of the things that he did was he looked at from 2017 on a number of these really advanced wide receiver metrics, that look at a player's ability to get open, to make tough catches, all of these different things. And Brandon Aiyuk's 2023 season actually came in at number 3. Blair talks about his ability to make catches, his ability to, evade coverage, to get himself open. And these are a lot of things that really foretell of a very, very talented wide receiver, which is why this whole situation with him has come to light. We do like DJ Moore. However, there's a lot of reason that you could point to more questions, I think, for more than Aiyuk. Even if Aiyuk ends up in Pittsburgh, I think if he ends up in Pittsburgh, that team is going to make it a point to feature him. And I think that Aiyuk is good enough that that type of role he's going to deliver.
That is awesome. Good stuff right there from Dave Caban talking about Aiyuk versus DJ Moore for sure. We've been talking about receivers a lot in this segment. Let's continue down that path because I know what you wrote about Michael Pittman, and I know the upside that DeVonta Smith represents for the Eagles too this year. When we look at their Fantasy Pros Championship ADP right now, we're seeing that I just had it in front of me. My apologies. DeVonta Smith is going as wide receiver 20 at the 403. And we see that Michael Pittman is in that more Aiyuk territory, ironically, wide receiver 22 at the 405. One of these guys is going to catch a lot of passes this year in maybe a more run dominant offense than the other that is going to catch a lot of passes for the Philadelphia Eagles when you consider A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith, Dallas Goedert. I mean, all those guys there are going to be fantastic.
So I wanted to make a case here for Michael Pittman, but I ended up just, determining that it's Smith. And to me, it's actually not very close. One of the things that I point to when you talk about Pittman that's very encouraging is we've seen him now with a number of lower level quarterbacks be successful. We've seen him outplay my personal expectations a number of seasons now. But the reality is it's hard for me to have more scenarios than not for Pittman, where you're not looking at a wide receiver 3 outcome as a pretty good season. I can make many more cases for DeVonta Smith. If you look in the range outcomes tool, you go through subjective projections. I think anybody that's doing those processes would end up pointing to Smith. Some of this has to do just by the nature that you have Pittman, who I think is a very good receiver, but playing with a quarterback who, though we saw flashes from Anthony Richardson, this isn't the type of offense where you're going to be expecting there to be the potential for 28, maybe 30 passing touchdowns, or an offense that's going to be putting together a ton of quality opportunities like you would with Philadelphia. The other thing I'll point to here is if you look at DeVonta Smith, he has been at stretches one of the top fantasy receivers in the league. We'll go back to the back half of 2022, where he was arguably the best wide receiver in fantasy for that stretch. Now, does that mean that's going to happen again? No. But knowing that that's the type of thing that's in play, that's a realistic scenario where I could not see that being the case for Pittman, I have to give the edge to Smith. A lot of that has to do with the offensive situation and just what we've seen them be able to do in the past.
So, okay, that's interesting because, well, I guess maybe it's not that interesting because, you look at the upside for these guys. I mean, DeVonta Smith, you're only paying 2 more picks higher than ADP. Again, I know that's nebulous and every draft is different. Yep. But the upside for Smith, I guess, is that much higher where when you're trying to win $1 million in the FFPC this year, that represents a better way for you to do it, right, than Pittman.
Yeah, I think it does. One of the things, too, that I tend to try to focus on here, like you mentioned earlier, kind of that context of that team. I think there's a lot of scenarios, too, where, Pittman, fails to put together a very compelling season. It's harder to imagine that in the case of Smith too. So it's hard for me to cut at a reason here why Pittman would be, at least to me, like if I'm forced in this binary choice here, why Pittman would be the more compelling option.
And that makes sense. I mean, I'm totally with you on this too, for sure. And I think most of the viewers are as well. Wide receiver position is chock full of these binary decisions that we have to make. And I'm going to give you another one here. Zay Flowers, who in my opinion, rightly or wrongly, has not been talked about enough, or maybe I'm just listening and reading the wrong content this drafting season. I don't think a lot of people are talking about that dude. And then Rashee Rice, we heard a lot about him when he was going through his off the field stuff. But since Hollywood Brown went down, since Xavier Worthy's been dropping passes in practice, we have not heard enough about him. I think these are underreported on guys right now that could be big time difference makers in the Fantasy Pros Championship, the FFPC main event this year, the FFPC Best Ball Tournament. Zay Flowers and Rashee Rice, wide receiver 27, wide receiver 28, respectively, going on average at the 505 and the 506. Who would you rather draft between those two this year, Dave?
Oh, this is such a fun one because these are two players being similarly priced. And when I try to do this analysis here and break this tie, it gets pretty tight. If you'd asked me, this is another one of those. If you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said that I got to give the edge to Flowers here because they're fairly similar. And I have, worries about what's going to happen with Rice in the situation that he has. We're kind of reaching the point now where it's like, I don't know if we're going to see disciplinary action anytime soon. You look at some of that context there of the Cincinnati offense, the way that Rice finished the season. Now, normally I would say that it doesn't make statistically, we don't see back halves of the season, carry into the next season, right? It's not a good way to try to, you can't really extrapolate that back half of the season to the next year and expect that to continue. One of the things that we've seen. However, though, with rookies, it's a little bit different, right? You saw Rice's usage in that offense, how comfortable he was. The stats that he was producing start to change as the season went on. As a result of that, to me, there's more of a chance that Rice breaks out, in that tremendous Chiefs offense in a way that, pushes him over the edge on Flowers for me. Just to give a little bit more context here, my projection for Zay Flowers assumes that he sees, somewhere around 24% of the target share for Baltimore, right? Which gets him to around 234 PPR. In the case of somebody like Rashee Rice, I think with a target share that could be achievable, we could see him getting into the 300s, which I don't see as a possibility for Flowers in as many range of outcomes.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah, why are people not talking about Flowers, Dave? I mean, have you heard a whole lot of chatter about him? I mean, I hear the Andrew stuff and the likely stuff, and Rashad Bateman, quite frankly, has been talked about a lot more than Zay Flowers this drafting season.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, the interesting thing here, right? We saw 25% of Flowers games last season finish with him as a wide receiver 1. If you look from week 12 on, 3 of his 5 games, he was a wide receiver 1, finished number 28 in PPR. He was 31 in expected points per game, was efficient. I think that he's one of those players. Now, in that question that I was just forced to answer, I talked about upside, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that people look at this Baltimore offense and it's hard to get like super enthused thinking, picturing him scoring all these lofty totals. But there is something to be said for a player like Flowers that you have on your roster where maybe he doesn't have as much, absolute high-end upside as some of these other players, but I would argue that his downside's better. He's going to be in your lineup contributing each week. So, maybe he's not the sexiest name, but I would say in a lot of constructions that I could see myself putting together, there's definitely a spot for Flowers. So, I'm forced to say Rice in this case, but I still like Flowers. And I agree with you that he's probably being overlooked.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have a lot of Zay Flowers this year. Just, it's one of those things. Look, what did Frank DuPont tell you? Right? Like when you think you're onto something and everybody else is not, they're giving you crap about it or whatever, you might be onto something. Okay.
Yep.
Wide receiver again. I don't know what it is about receivers this year. They're very, very compelling to me. Diontae Johnson, Dave.
Yep.
Dealing with a groin strain. He did not practice today. He's probably not playing against the Jets on Saturday in preseason week 2 or week 3, depending upon if you count the Hall of Fame game. Diontae Johnson, or the new millionaire in Tennessee in Calvin Ridley, who got paid a ton of money to catch passes from Will Levis this season. Right now, if you look at their ADPs, these guys are both going in drafts at the late 6th, early 7th. No, I should say just mid 6th, late 6th. Calvin Ridley 608, Diontae Johnson at the 610. Who would you rather draft this year?
This one's a fun one, right? Because they're both players that have changed teams. It's a little bit hard to know exactly what we can expect from these guys. The way that I break this tie is I just have a lot of concerns about that Carolina Panthers team. And obviously you could throw a lot of concerns out there about Tennessee, but I'm going to give the edge here to Calvin Ridley over Diontae Johnson. I think that the case that you could make for him being, they might just need to give him a ton of targets, but you could maybe make the same case for Ridley. So like, as I'm having this internal debate, it's hard for me to come up with a reason why I'm more jazzed up on Johnson than Ridley. Honestly, though, I don't see myself with too much of either of these players.
And that's interesting to me because I think Diontae Johnson represents a situation where he could be a target hog this year, and you can get him at a discount because of the groin strain right now. And Calvin Ridley, everything, and I viewers of the show are going to say, but Balky, we're sick of saying that you saying this, but it's true. Everything the Titans have done in the offseason screams that they want to throw the ball. They want to pass the ball. They want to get chunk gains from, Ridley, Okonkwo, Hopkins, Pollard, Spears, all these guys, Boyd, Treylon Burks, for God's sake, if you're nasty. So I think that there's a lot to like about this Tennessee Titans offense, and yet you're kind of out on both of these players this year.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, I guess there is some unknowns to what's going to happen here, and you are talking about a 6th-round pick, so it's not like they're free or anything like that.
Right. So I'm pulling up the our ADP listing here quickly and taking a look at these guys. Right. I see names like Jaden Reed behind them. Keenan Allen's kind of in that similar range. Yep. And I think a lot of it just goes back to the situations that they're in. Now, Reed might have more competition. It's hard to make this case about him being this ball hog, but much more quality opportunities. I actually think that Jaden Reed's going to lead that team in targets. I think you're going to see him emerge as like a really, a star this year in a lot of context. As a result of that, that kind of informs my comment there about probably being out on them more. Right. Like, to me, it's always a little bit troubling when the best case that you have for a player is they're just going to be a target hog.
Yeah. And this is something I brought up with my former co-host of the HSFFO, Dave the Dizzle Gerzak, FFPC co-founder, Michael Turner. This is something we've talked about with him over the years. He's an accumulator, right? Yeah. And when you're talking about a running back where like what can you say? What does he do well? Well, he gets the ball a ton. Maybe not the greatest adjective that you can give a guy or descriptor that you can give a guy, which is why you want to take him in the 2nd round of a draft. Similarly, Diontae Johnson here in the 6th round. Well, he's going to get the ball out. Okay, well, what's he going to do with it? I mean, is he going to catch it? Is he going to turn it into something? So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. Moving further down the wide receiver ADP chain, Jermaine Burton and Marvin Mims. Burton, a player that I think a lot of Dynasty players were excited about, Dave. I don't know what your shares are like on Burton in your Dynasty leagues. But then Marvin Mims, I know a lot of guys and women, quite frankly, that I draft with who were over the moon about Marvin Mims in the 3rd round of rookie drafts last year. And we're still taking him in like the 10th or 11th round of redrafts last year. Obviously disappointed by what he did. And now it's weird because Burton and Mims are kind of going back to back, late 16th, early 17th round, that 16-17 turn. When it gets to be spots like this, I understand that most people want to get equal shares of both, or maybe not. How do you feel about Mims v. Burton? Who would you take if you were only in one league?
This is another super fun one. When I first read this, I was thinking that Mims was going to be the answer. You go through kind of that typical process of, Mims could end up possibly being, the 1st or 2nd, option in his offense. Jermaine Burton playing with 2 of arguably the best wide receivers in the league, and you think you're going to make the case for Mims. You could make the case that, last year, week 2, week 3, we saw him put together wide receiver 2 finishes. I think he had like 20 points in week 2, right? But the thing is, I then start digging into these numbers some, and I look at what they can do in those offenses, and the Bengals offense looks like it's going to provide much more opportunity for Burton to outplay Mims. And I say that because if I look at Denver, and I do like Bo Nix, but I think about that offense holistically, you might be looking at a lot of seasons, a lot of outcomes where Bo Nix and the Denver offense doesn't get to 20 touchdown passes. Right. And that is, when you're talking about players like this and you're trying to break a tie, a very easy way to do it. I mean, Jermaine Burton, I think he easily slates in there as the wide receiver 3 in Cincinnati, given the fact that there is this running back situation where we could see Chase Brown get targeted. But in a baseline scenario, you're not going to give him that Joe Mixon share. So he might be around 7. Maybe he gets up to 10. At tight end, Gesicki's not going to command a high target share, I don't think. We could very realistically see Jermaine Burton with a target share of 14%, which in an offense like the Bengals with Joe Burrow throwing the ball, I think gives him a higher ceiling than Mims and probably a stronger floor. As a result of it, this ended up actually being an easy one for me. I'd rather have Jermaine Burton.
Oh, Burton. And does Yoshevich factor into this at all, given the positive pub we've heard about him over the last week and a half or so?
I don't think so. To me, he feels like one of these guys. There was a lot of hype early on with him. It's going to continue to stick around. We haven't seen it manifest. As a result of that, to me, I'd rather put my money behind a guy where there's the opportunity for it to happen. I think that there's reasons to think that it will.
Moving on here to running back. I know we talked about the Jaguars a little bit earlier, but I want to focus on Travis Etienne here. And I also want to focus on Derrick Henry. Two players that are in very different situations. Etienne, same team he's always been with. Basically the same offense, same OC, same head coach for the most part. But then Derrick Henry, not in Tennessee anymore. Now he's in Baltimore. And you can make the case that this is obviously an upgrade for him. Better offensive line, better offense, better everything in Baltimore. Etienne currently going as running back 9 at the 211. Derrick Henry just in front of him, running back 7 at the 210. If you could only draft one of these players this year, who would you rather draft?
Etienne. And
wow, that was fast. That was the quickest response we've ever gotten to any question on this. Why is the Etienne over Henry without even thinking?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to like Etienne that I think people will lose sight of. And I think that the biggest thing is when we're talking about these contests like FFPC, where running backs score points via receptions, there's a lot of reasons to feel really good about Travis Etienne. You know, you look at his comps from prior seasons, you're expecting that in more outcomes than not, he's getting to 15 PPR per game. Derrick Henry, you cannot say that with. Now, of course, he's in maybe the best situation in the league for him. You know, they're in Baltimore, but the difference is going to come down to that. I think that you look at Etienne, you've heard what I said earlier about Trevor Lawrence and what things could look like for him. I think we see Etienne end up with, I'm quickly pulling up my outlook here on him. I think we see Etienne end up with, you know, maybe somewhere around 50 receptions, putting him in the 90th percentile of receptions for running backs. And I think that those points are what's going to make the difference over Derrick Henry. Now, you know, that is recognizing that running backs have had a ton of success in Baltimore, that, you know, he should have ample opportunity to score touchdowns. All that said, you know, I can assume a very high number of touchdowns for Derrick Henry, you know, cresting up to 12, 13. But the difference in the PPR that I expect to come, you know, from Etienne having the possibility of, you know, maybe adding an additional, you know, 2-3 receiving touchdowns over Henry, it just, you know, fills that void.
I think that in cases like this, in leagues where I'm kind of torn between two running backs, and I know I'm going to make up my mind between these two, I always break ties in favor of the pass catcher. And yep. I know it seems like trite and it may not make a difference. I think in this case it does. I don't really envision, especially, you know, not only with Derrick Henry not being a massive pass catcher over the course of his career, now he's in an offense with a running quarterback. And the stats would tell us, and the history would tell us, running quarterbacks historically do not check down to the running backs a whole lot. So I don't think it goes up this year for Henry as far as his catches go. If anything, it stays the same or goes down. So I think Etienne's the guy there. I'm with you there. Now, Trey Benson is a rookie in Arizona. A lot of people are excited about him. It looks like he is the heir apparent to James Conner there. However, heir apparent means he's still not the guy. And Conner is still ahead of him this year. Flip it over to Dallas, and we've heard different things come out from beat reporters from the Cowboys that Rico Dowdle might not make the team, and Rico Dowdle might be the number one guy there. Benson and Elliott happen to be going back-to-back right now as running back 40 and 41 at the 10-10 and 10-12 on ADP in the Fantasy Pros Championship right now. You can make a case for both these guys, right? Elliott could be a guy that you stick in, maybe not the highest ceiling in the world, but certainly a player that you could feel good about flexing out or starting as a running back 2 on certain weeks. And then Trey Benson. Some people would say the best running back in this year's draft. Some people would say that they like him better than James Conner this year in Arizona, given the draft capital. When you're focused on these two players individually at the halfway point of Fantasy Pros Championship drafts, what are you doing, Dave Caban? Are you taking Benson or are you taking Elliott?
Oh, this one's easy. I'm taking Benson every time, right? This one, I'm not going to try to hedge in any way. And when I wrote my piece on Arizona, I actually got a couple of questions kind of pushing back some on why I actually am assigning more of that offensive workload to Trey Benson than James Conner. Now, James Conner was fantastic last year, right? He finished the year with 5 straight performances at or above 20 points, was an RB1 46% of the time. You know, he was 6th in rushing yards, 11 among running backs in PPR per game. But I'm thinking that's just all the more reason that I like Trey Benson. We've done a lot of work that has shown that running backs have their best seasons in years 1 and year 2, that their win rates in best ball contests are the best in year 1 or year 2. A lot of that has to do because their ADP gets depressed. You have a guy like Trey Benson, who at this point in his career, I think might be better. I would say probably, I really like Trey Benson better than James Conner. So to me, you look at the upside for him, or even what he might be able to achieve in a season where he's still in a share with Conner. And I just think it's stronger than what you're going to see with Elliott. Like, to me, it doesn't make any sense really to be adding Ezekiel Elliott to my roster at this point in his career, when I have the opportunity to get a rookie running back that I think is very talented and a pretty kind of compelling offense this year, who sets up for that profile that we like at RotoViz to be a league winning running back. He's one of those players, I think, that, you know, when Sean's zero running back watch list comes out, a lot of people are going to be interested to see, you know, what does Sean think about Benson and Conner? But Benson's one of those players that really falls into that mold. So I'm very excited about him.
Yeah, I mean, when in doubt, this is a young man's game, and I don't have to look at it much deeper than that. Benson versus Elliott, I'm taking Benson. Elliott is a fine player this year, and I have no qualms about taking him. But if I'm faced between Benson or Elliott, it's Benson every time.
Yep.
Real quick on this last one, tight end. Mike Gesicki, Greg Dulcich, 1702, 1705, respectively. Tight end 26, tight end 27. Normally, I don't bring up tight ends this deep, but if you're trying to get a third tight end, a high-end third tight end, if you waited on tight end, maybe you're taking a third tight end, something like this, you have a feeling on Dulcich versus Gesicki this year?
Yeah, definitely. So Gesicki is actually a player, like you said, that I have filled out a lot of my tight end rooms with, if you will. We've done a lot of research in best ball leagues where we see that, you know, it does make sense to wait till the end, kind of grab 3 tight ends at the back end of the draft. Gesicki is one of those guys I normally put in. This goes back to what I talked about earlier. I do not see a lot of touchdown potential in Denver. And, you know, I think that Gesicki could have a game here and there where he has a couple of good looks. As a result, it's easy for me to, you know, make that decision and go his way.
Yeah, I'm with you on Gesicki. Like, I think that Cincinnati Bengals thing is so compelling. Burton, Yoshibus, Gesicki, when you consider that Higgins and Chase are maybe not in the greatest space right now as far as their contracts go with Cincinnati. This is a team that I think is very compelling this year. We talked about Chase Brown and Zach Moss. Getting the Bengals right will be paramount to getting your $1 million grand prize winning team in the FFPC main event Fantasy Pros Championship, what have you, with the FFPC this year. Dave Caban from RotoViz.com, one of the co-owners of that site. Of course, you know him from, or you follow him on X at Dave Caban FF. I'm Eric Balkman from the FFPC. Let's go Fantasy Football 201. Let's go Fantasy Football Dynasty scenarios in August in this next segment here. In regards to what you do with JJ McCarthy, with what you do with your future picks, and what you look for in players to cut or not cut in roster cutdowns. You're watching the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network.
Flair once said, if you want to be the man, you got to beat the man. And if you want to be the man or woman this fantasy football season, you got to play over at myffpc.com. That's where all the best fantasy gamers play. That's where all the high stakes gamers play, because they've got the high stakes leagues. They have the best formats. They have the best payouts. It's the place to be. And if you win a FFPC main event or a Fantasy Pros Championship contest over there, you put some serious respect on your name and some money in your pocket. Anyone can win their hometown league, right? You're probably a great fantasy gamer. Prove it. You go out and win an event like this, you can go and put in your Twitter bio or X bio, FFPC main event champion. That means something. That's definitive proof that you're one of the best fantasy gamers in the world. So go over to myffpc.com and use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more. And now you're on your road to greatness, right? You could even do an online draft, or you can go and draft in Las Vegas with the stars. Draft at Planet Hollywood for the FFPC main event. That's where they're all doing it. It's awesome stuff. So get set up now so that you can be a star this year. You can be the man. Just like Ric Flair, you can be a champion. Woo!
football. This month, more men and women will go draft than ever before in our country's history. With prize pools at record highs, multiple fantasy players will become millionaires this year playing the game they love. This month, thousands of drafters will compete in redraft, best ball and dynasty leagues, and with innovative formats, they can look forward to a host of high-stakes competition. It's August again in fantasy football, and under the FFPC, high-stakes fantasy is bigger and better than ever before. Why would you ever settle for less?
The FFPC main event wide open with slow and live drafts filling each and every day at myffpc.com. I apologize. Everything has filled up for tonight, but don't forget we have drafts going on tomorrow beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern time and then continuing at 7 p.m. Eastern time, 10 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow night. 8 spots left still in that 1 o'clock draft tomorrow, so take advantage of that. 1 spot remaining in the 7 o'clock draft and a half dozen spots remaining in that 10 o'clock draft tomorrow night. myffpc.com. Take your chance at a $1 million grand prize in a nearly $6 million prize pool. Dave Caban from RotoViz.com at Dave Caban FF on the X joining me tonight. I want to talk because I know Dynasty is your expertise. Is that your favorite format to play, Dave?
So this is actually a funny question. And Curtis Patrick and I always used to joke about this. I actually still, my favorite format is just your typical redraft league, right? That standalone thing. Dynasty is definitely fun. But for me, it still remains that redraft league. Nonetheless, though, I just love all formats. So, any fantasy football I'm down for.
Especially auction, right?
Oh, yes. Yes, you're right. Actually, I have to make that correction. Auction drafts are actually my favorite format, depending on how you look at things. I'm just going to say it's auctions.
Just curiously, so I only do a couple of auctions every year. And I don't know if I take the approach the right way. But basically, I have a budget going in where I know how much I want my team construction to look like. And I have a budget of what I'm going to spend with every player in that format. And I'm willing to spend up for players I like by a couple of bucks. I'm also willing to take discounts on players I don't necessarily like all that much. What am I doing right? Not what I'm doing right. What am I doing wrong? How do you normally approach auction drafts?
So I'll say
and just real quick, and before you start, and I apologize for interrupting, you have a whole series on rotoviz.com.
I do. Yes. Yeah. So I think that the biggest thing that I would say there, and there's so much nuance to this, which is one of the reasons that auctions are so fun, is you definitely have to work with your budget. But the thing is, it's got to be more malleable, perhaps, than the way that you've presented, right? Because once that draft starts and players go at certain prices, it can completely dictate the prices that certain tiers are going to go for. And as a result of that, kind of what you're doing is you're looking to identify what tiers by position are going for and then build your team around that way. So it's more thinking about how you can react given what the tiers pricing are versus trying to allocate percentage of budgets to your positions, because that goes out of the window pretty quickly. Like the best example I could give is in lots of drafts, if the high level running backs like the, Christian McCaffrey's, Jahmyr Gibbs of the world, if they go for a lot of money, that means that some of the players, the tiers below, are going to go a lot cheaper than you might expect.
Right.
So as a result of that, that can shift the percentage of that budget that you're going to have to give to those different positions. So what I like to do is have a couple of paths that I can go down versus trying to budget that way. That's the best concise answer I can give. I got some articles where we're looking at supply and demand curves and we're really digging in. But the biggest piece of advice I will give to people here is you do not go into an auction draft with a list of values that says this is what this player should go for. What's going to happen is you're either going to overpay for players or you're going to price yourself out, because those values have nothing to do with your auction. They might be based on a league that has entirely different, settings than yours, or has different number of players on the roster, which would throw all of those values out of the window. And you can't just take a percentage because the percentages would flip if the settings and the rosters are different. So I'll get off my soapbox for that now, but there's a lot there.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing. Like, I guess maybe what I should be doing is coming in with the framework of what I like as far as positions go, but understanding that those could change wildly based on how those players start coming off the board. The first, 10, 15 players, depending on who they are announced. This is good because I'm doing auctions for the first time ever in my life, I believe. Yeah, back-to-back days, which
that's awesome.
No, it's not. I mean, maybe, but I mean, these are.
It is. They're so fun. They're so fun.
Here's the thing. There's like 4 now. I will preface this by saying normally I when I draft these, this is in the KFFSC.com.
Yeah.
I draft these auctions, but normally I have a co-manager who is notorious for bidding early and often.
Yep.
And then I sit there for 3 hours.
Yep.
And and I'm waiting. Now it's just me this year. So I'll be able to, maybe it'll be more compelling because I don't have to worry about him going, $40 on George Kittle or $70 Calvin Johnson, as is what he's been wont to do in the past. So yeah, maybe it will be fun.
Do me one favor. Just don't wait too long to start bidding and getting the action. Do not wait too long. Okay.
I used to be in a private, like a basement auction league here in Northeast Wisconsin. And there was a guy, he might even be watching right now, so I apologize to him. But he always used to wait, and he'd leave 2/3 of his money on the board. And I'm like, oh my God. Now, we had a rule in those leagues where you could carry it over to your fab. But still, it was not worth it.
That's pennies on the dollar.
Pennies on the dollar, indeed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, trust me, I never do that. It's not even fun to draft that way. Okay, let's talk about JJ McCarthy as far as Dynasty Superflex leagues go.
Yes.
So we know he's out for the year with the meniscus. It sounds like he's going to be good to go for 2025. What do you do right now, August 15th, 2024, in Superflex leagues with McCarthy? If you own him, if you don't own him, what's the proper way to handle him right now? Because I think that this could represent a buying/selling opportunity.
Yeah, it definitely could. So I think that the first thing I'll say to this is the way I would approach this as a dynasty manager is I am not going to let my opinion of JJ McCarthy, of what I think of him as a player, influence things too much, because with quarterbacks, we really just don't know. I've done a lot of research in trying to model quarterbacks. What I have found is you really can't do it that well. NFL teams don't do it that well. It's very hard to get right. As a result of that, if you have the opportunity where a manager wants to get out from JJ McCarthy and you're probably doing it a little bit cheaper than you would have been a couple of weeks ago, I think it's worth taking, right? If you have that need and you have that room on your roster, because you just don't know, he could turn out to be a very serviceable quarterback. And I think that he will, in Minnesota, have the opportunity to be a player that in Superflex, you're going to feel decent about trotting out every week. Even if you don't disagree, you really don't know. So I think it's worth trying to buy that dip if you can. Now, if I'm a manager, I am not going to unload McCarthy just because of this injury. I'm really going to be tactful, and I'm going to make that move if it's addressing a need that I have on my roster in this year, or somehow setting my team up to fill a gap that it has in the future. So I think it's an opportunity for you to recognize, if you have McCarthy, you can use him now to make your team stronger. If you don't have McCarthy, he's worth considering if you have that need.
I think that's what it comes down to is what does your team look like? And I think there is a way to take advantage, whether you're buying or selling him at this point, based on his knee injury. Let's jump around here a little bit. Roster cut down is something I never look forward to. I want to keep as many players on my roster as I can, but inevitably before the start of the season, I have to cut down. I have to get rid of some of the chaff on my team. I have to separate it. I also know the way, and Dave, I don't know if you have an opinion on this, the way I like to operate my fantasy teams, those last 3, 4, maybe even 5 picks or 5 players on my roster, I like them fungible. I like them flexible. I like them to be players that I can cut and get rid of at a moment's notice, and I don't feel bad about that. That's a little bit more difficult in dynasty leagues, right? Because these are your babies, right? These are the guys you want to keep around as long as you can. When it comes to cut down leagues for you, or cut down time in your leagues for you in dynasty, what types of players do you know you need to keep that roster cut down, and what types of players are you willing to say bye-bye to and let them go to free agency?
Sure. So the way that I look at my roster when I'm making these decisions is I classify players into, normally like 3 or 4 groups, right? So I got my starters, then I've got my rotational players, I've got my fill-ins, and I've got my my guys that are basically I consider part of the waiver wire. So my back 3 or 4 or 5 spots I view as synonymous with the waiver wire. So the types of players that I'm cutting are those where the only reason that they would have come on my team in the first place was I was just taking a swing that this player could hit in some way I didn't expect. Now, maybe that doesn't help everybody out there that didn't fill out their roster like that. So what I would say you do is you have to force yourself to remove the names from these players. Just look at their numbers, think about the context of what they have coming, and ask yourself, really how many players out there on the waiver wire are these guys, fairly synonymous with? And that's kind of the way that I break it. So I think about, if I had to go and replace this guy, which one of these are there the most players on the waiver wire that look like? And that's kind of how I go about, making those decisions. But what it really comes down to me is kind of, I had to learn. I actually picked this up playing fantasy baseball. I was really heavily back into fantasy baseball in college, a little bit more so than football at the time. And it really became an exercise of like, my best example was I did not want to cut Maglio Ordonez, but it reached a point where like I had to recognize Maglio Ordonez is not Maglio Ordonez anymore. And I had to cut him. Like, I don't know if I cut him, but I had to get him off the team. Yeah. And then the other thing was, I'd been following players. I worked for an internship at a AA baseball team. So I was seeing all these prospects coming through and I'd get excited to add them to my teams.
Dave, which one? Just curiously.
New Hampshire Fisher Cats.
Okay. All right. And they were the parent or what was the parent club?
It was, I think it was the Blue Jays. I think it was the Blue Jays. This was a long time ago now. I was only there for a little bit of time. But anyways, I'd get all excited about these guys I'd come seeing through, right? And then you'd have a lot of trouble letting go of these guys because, I actually met a couple of these guys. Like, it was cool to see them make their way on. But the reality is, the more of these guys you saw come through, you realize that if they were ever on that back end of your bench, the chances that they actually got higher than that, pretty low. Mm-hmm. So the takeaway here is you need to say to yourself, how often have I just kept a guy on my roster and then he, year over year for him to do nothing, and then he actually returns versus how long have I kept the guy and he's just sunk my team, right? If he's at the back end of your roster, hasn't done anything before, there isn't a good context, that guy might as well be on the waiver wire. Just let him go. I don't know if this helps, but it's kind of reframing the way that you think.
That should be the way that we think about it. That's the way I think about it for sure. And by the way, the Fisher Cats, Toronto Blue Jays AA.
Okay, nice.
There you go. So good memory there. I want to, as we don't normally we don't talk about Dynasty in August, but one of the things I've talked about with the FFPC guys here is we're really, and women, I should say, we're really surprised at Dynasty sales, Dynasty startups at this time of year. They've been selling really well, which we're understanding like, okay, people playing the FFPC want to play fantasy football 365 days a year. Yeah. This is why we're dedicating a Dynasty segment here. And I think that when we're talking about buying high and selling low and stuff like that, to me, if you want to live that strategy, you sell on these draft picks, or excuse me, you buy on these draft picks now when they're super cheap, because as we get closer to April, they're going to be astronomical. Where do you stand on acquiring these future picks now in August, Dave? Is this something that we can get done? Is this something that's very difficult to do? How do you handle it in your Dynasty leagues?
I think that it actually is something you can get done. I think people get so exuberant about the upcoming season that they'll kind of lose sight of how valuable some of those future picks can be. So I generally do think you try to get them through. One of the things that I've done on some of my teams is if you get a number of these, futures that are, maybe in the later rounds, and you just continue to stack those, eventually you can start to put those, into more usable picks or more usable spots on your roster. And it kind of gives you some flexibility. So I actually think, and we've talked about this on our show on the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast sometimes, how these times of the year where people aren't really thinking about Dynasty give you a chance to kind of engage and make some deals that other times of the year would be much harder to get done, because it's easy to view it as a throwaway because you're so focused on the season that's about to start.
Right. I would say that too. Like, as far as fantasy baseball goes, this is the time I always strike on either punting on my teams or whatever, or acquiring future picks or prospects.
Yeah.
Because everybody's focused on football right now.
Yep.
And I'm grinding the waiver wire extra hard this time of year because everybody's focused on football. So whatever. That's neither here nor there. But I think you can apply it to football in regards to baseball as well for some people who love fantasy baseball going forward. Dave, holy cow, did we get through a lot tonight? But in my opinion, not enough. There's never enough time when we can sit down and talk with you about fantasy football and fantasy baseball, as it were, tonight as well. When we want to consume more Dave Caban content, RotoViz.com. Just tell us everything that you're working on right now so we know.
Sure. So go to RotoViz.com. We have a plethora of content coming out. I'm finishing up my projection series, going through all of the teams, explaining, my keynotes for them. I also have my auction draft guide for 2024 going on, which is publishing on the site. We're also going to get some final thoughts on some of these range of outcomes from our tools for players as the season progresses. I've been on a little bit of a hiatus on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show, but if you check out the RotoViz radio feed, you'll make sure that you're getting a ton of awesome shows. Sean Siegel and Ben Gretsch do a fantastic show. Colin Kelly is involved in a number of shows. And, a lot of the work that I'm doing informs some of the things that they're talking about on there. So, if you're interested in these tools that we have, some of the models that we built, the statistical analysis that Blair Andrews, and others have done, you're going to get a lot of it trickling up into those shows. So check out that RotoViz radio feed. Check out RotoViz. And I'm also on X, but I admittedly, I'm not very active. But
I noticed that.
I don't really like it. But feel free to shoot me a note on there. If anybody has anything they're interested in.
Well, I think the thing, honestly, and this is probably gonna maybe lose me followers, but I'm only on there to promote shows and promote stuff I do. I don't really go on there to this is my take on this player. This is my take on this player or whatever.
Well, it just distracts from, doing the productive things that we need to do. It makes more sense if I'm doing analysis than trying to argue with somebody why I like, Trey Benson.
I think that's the way I would approach it. I know there's certain people that like to go on there and actually get into arguments because they feel like it forces them to do the work of why they feel about a certain player. But you guys at RotoViz, you're already doing the work. So it doesn't even matter. Dave Caban at Dave Caban FF, RotoViz.com. Check it out. Everything that Dave is producing is on there. I want to wrap up tonight's show by thanking Dave and our producer, Sean Engel. Next Thursday, we are back 7 p.m. Eastern time. Connor Allen from 4 for 4 will be my guest co-host. Check out the Fantasy Pros Championship. New drafts filling each and every day, slow and live drafts. In fact, we have 3 options for you tonight at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and 11:55 p.m. all Eastern time. Take your chance at $1 million tonight. You can maybe put together a juggernaut here on August 15, 2024. FFPC main event, FFPC Superflex Best Ball Tournament, FFPC Best Ball Tournament, all going on at myffpc.com. Empire Leagues and Dynasty Startups also at myffpc.com. Thanks for watching, everybody. For Dave Caban, I'm Eric Balkman. We'll see you next week, everybody. Enjoy your Thursday night.